They say regret has its own kind of weight, an invisible one that settles over you, pressing down quietly until it fills the very air you breathe. And in the end, that weight becomes a constant, an unwelcome shadow that stays with you, woven into every decision, every memory. As I sit here now, far from the estate and the life I once thought was secure, I can feel the remnants of that weight, a heavy reminder of what I allowed myself to lose. I've had months to untangle my mistakes, to try to understand what led me down a path that was as thrilling as it was dangerous. It wasn't just about desire or betrayal. Those were part of it, of course. But there was more beneath the surface, hidden layers of longing and fear that shaped my every choice. I couldn't see it then, not clearly. But now I understand that I was looking for something beyond the life I had built with Jonathan. I was searching for a piece of myself that had slipped away, though I didn't know it at the time. And then there was Arlo. He wasn't supposed to be there, in that house, in that life. And yet, the moment he stepped into my world, everything shifted. He was an unexpected presence, a reminder of a life lived on impulse, on instinct. Being with him felt like stepping into another world, one where I was no longer bound by duty or expectation. But of course, such freedom comes with a cost. And I was blind to just how high that price would be. What I remember most is the quiet, the hushed silence that filled every corner of the estate, that settled like fog over the cliffs and the shore. That silence held all our secrets, each one a shadow stretching between us, growing darker and heavier with every passing day. I thought I could keep them hidden, that I could balance the pieces of my life without them colliding. But secrets have a way of surfacing, especially the ones you guard most closely. Now, looking back, I see the danger signs I ignored, the moments I brushed aside in my desperation to hold on to something that was never mine to keep. It was all just a matter of time before those choices unraveled, leaving me with nothing but the silence and the memories of what I had lost. The estate sits empty now, its walls holding the stories I once believed I could leave behind. And though I can't go back, though the past is fixed and unchangeable, I can see those choices clearly, etched into the life I tried so hard to protect. And so the story I'll tell you is not one of forgiveness or redemption. It is, quite simply, a story of consequence, of shadows that grew too long, of desires that became their own undoing. The estate sat perched on a cliff overlooking the Atlantic, a sprawling property with manicured lawns that stretched down toward the beach and rooms lined with floor-to-ceiling windows. In my years with Jonathan, I had grown accustomed to the quiet splendor of the place. The way the ocean's gray-blue vastness was framed perfectly in every window, the way the rooms held a hushed elegance that reminded me of the life Jonathan had built through years of relentless work. It was a place that seemed to absorb sound, to hold secrets in its walls, and perhaps that's why I felt at home there, even as my own quiet desires slowly took root, growing in the silence between Jonathan and me. Jonathan was my second husband. We had married a decade ago, and though he was almost 10 years my senior, we'd settled into a rhythm that I thought was stability. He was steady, accomplished, and deeply private, a man who had spent much of his life building his real estate empire before retiring to enjoy the wealth he had earned. We had met through mutual friends, and over time I found comfort in his quiet strength, his ability to bring order to a world that often felt chaotic. He valued refinement, control, and precision, qualities I had admired and tried to emulate. But with time, those very qualities had begun to feel like walls, boundaries that kept me at a distance. Jonathan had grown even more reserved, as if the luxury he surrounded himself with was enough to satisfy him, enough to fill the silence that settled between us. I realized slowly that our life was more about maintaining appearances than true connection. Conversations felt like routines, our days like rituals that required only our presence, not our hearts. When Jonathan told me that his son, Arlo, would be staying with us for a few weeks, I was surprised. Jonathan rarely spoke of Arlo, the son from his first marriage, a young man who seemed to be as free-spirited and restless as Jonathan was contained and disciplined. I had met Arlo a handful of times over the years, but he had always seemed like a stranger, a young man shaped by a life far removed from the world Jonathan and I inhabited. "He needs a change of pace," Jonathan had said one evening over dinner. His tone carefully measured, as though he were trying to convince himself as much as me. "It'll be good for him to be here, away from distractions." I hadn't pressed him for details, sensing the undercurrent of tension in his voice. But I wondered about Arlo, about the life he had been living, and why, after years of near silence, Jonathan wanted him to stay with us. It felt like an interruption in our carefully constructed lives, a sudden and unexpected intrusion. And yet, there was a part of me that welcomed it, a part of me that was quietly intrigued by the prospect of change, of something new in our otherwise predictable world. Arlo arrived on a cloudy afternoon, the sky a mix of slate gray and muted blue, as he pulled his car up the gravel drive. I watched from the window, catching sight of him as he stepped out, and I was struck by how different he looked from the last time I'd seen him. He had grown leaner, his hair slightly longer, falling in dark waves around his face. He wore a simple black jacket and jeans, his posture relaxed, almost defiant, as though he had stepped into a world he had no intention of fitting into. Jonathan greeted him with a handshake, his expression as reserved as always, and I felt a pang of awkwardness as I stepped forward, offering a polite smile. "It's good to see you, Arlo," I said, extending a hand. He took it briefly, his touch warm, his gaze steady as he looked at me, a hint of curiosity in his eyes. "Thanks," he replied, his voice calm, his tone measured. "It's been a while." There was a moment of silence, a pause that felt almost tangible, as though the weight of unspoken words hung in the air between us. Jonathan cleared his throat, breaking the silence, and led Arlo into the house, his voice low as he spoke about the estate, about the renovations we had made since Arlo's last visit. I followed behind, listening as Jonathan pointed out the details he had added. The new marble in the entryway, the antique chandelier he had imported from France, the landscaping he had commissioned to give the property an air of timeless elegance. Arlo nodded, his gaze lingering on the details, though his expression remained unreadable. He was polite, attentive, but there was a subtle distance in his demeanor, as though he were observing us, taking in the life we had built without ever fully stepping into it. That evening, we had dinner in the main dining room, the ocean stretching out beyond the windows, the waves churning under the cloudy sky. Jonathan asked Arlo questions about his work, his plans, each inquiry delivered with a formality that felt almost like an interview. "Still painting?" Jonathan asked, his tone casual but with a hint of expectation. Arlo nodded, cutting into his meal. "Yes, when I can. I've been experimenting with new techniques." Jonathan raised an eyebrow, a faint smile playing at his lips. "Art is a challenging path, but you're committed to it then?" There was a pause, a flicker of something in Arlo's expression, pride, defiance, perhaps a touch of resentment. "I am," he said simply, his voice calm but firm. "It's what I meant to do." I watched them, sensing the tension that lay beneath their exchange, the subtle clash of values that shaped their relationship. Jonathan had always hoped Arlo would follow in his footsteps, would see the world as a place to conquer, to mold according to his will. But Arlo was different, a man who moved to his own rhythm, driven by a passion that Jonathan seemed to regard with a mixture of pride and skepticism. And as I sat there, watching them, I felt a strange sense of connection with Arlo, a shared understanding of the unspoken distance that lay between us and Jonathan, a distance that went beyond words. In the days that followed, I found myself drawn to Arlo, intrigued by the quiet intensity he carried, the way he moved through the estate as though he were both a part of it and somehow above it. He would spend hours out on the cliffs, sketching the landscape, his gaze focused, his expression thoughtful. I would watch him from the house, fascinated by his solitude, by the quiet determination that seemed to guide him. One afternoon, I found him in the library, flipping through a book on Renaissance art, his fingers tracing the edges of a painting, his gaze intent. I hesitated, feeling a strange flutter in my chest, a sense of vulnerability I hadn't felt in years. "You have a good eye," I said, stepping into the room, my voice soft. He looked up, offering a small smile. "It's one of my favorite periods. The attention to detail, the light." There was a pause, a moment of silence that felt both comfortable and charged, and I realized, with a pang of surprise, that I wanted to know more about him, about his life, his work, the things that drove him. It was a feeling I hadn't expected. A quiet desire that seemed to grow with each passing day, each moment we spent together. "Would you show me your work sometime?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. He nodded, his gaze steady, a hint of curiosity in his eyes. "I'd like that." And in that moment, I felt a connection, a bond that went beyond words, a shared understanding, a silent agreement that neither of us could name. It was thrilling, terrifying, a reminder of the boundaries I had crossed in my heart, even if I hadn't yet crossed them in action. From that day on, I found myself seeking out moments to be near him, to hear his thoughts, to catch glimpses of the passion that drove him. It was a quiet dance, a careful balance of glances and unspoken words, each one a reminder of the risk we were taking, the line we were approaching. Jonathan seemed oblivious, preoccupied with his own routines, his own world. He would spend his days reviewing investment reports, managing his estate from a distance, confident in the life he had built. I, meanwhile, moved through each day with a strange sense of anticipation, a longing that felt both new and familiar, as though I were rediscovering a part of myself that had been buried for years. One evening, as I stood by the window, watching the waves crash against the shore, I felt a warmth settle over me, a quiet certainty that what I was feeling was real, that it was more than just a fleeting desire. I knew the risks, the consequences, but in that moment, none of it mattered. I was alive, in a way I hadn't felt in years, and I was ready to embrace whatever came next. It started with a single touch, a brief, almost accidental brush of our hands as we stood in the garden one morning. The estate was wrapped in a soft mist, the air cool and still, and we were alone, Jonathan having left for a day trip to the neighboring town. I had bent to examine a small patch of roses, their petals glistening with dew, when I felt Arlo's hand reach out, steadying me. I looked up, and there it was, that unspoken tension that had been growing between us, a connection that hummed just beneath the surface, waiting to be acknowledged. His hand lingered on mine for a heartbeat too long, and in that moment, something shifted. The line we had danced around for days was crossed, and there was no going back. From that day on, our encounters took on a new intensity. We became careful, deliberate, each glance, each word laced with a thrill that was as exhilarating as it was terrifying. There were stolen moments in the quiet corners of the house, in the library where he showed me his sketches, in the secluded alcove of the garden where he would brush a hand across my shoulder, his touch light but filled with promise. We developed a rhythm, a silent understanding, slipping into each other's presence whenever Jonathan was occupied or out of the room. I felt alive in a way I hadn't in years. My senses heightened, every interaction charged with a sense of possibility, of freedom. It was a new kind of intimacy, one that went beyond physical attraction. I saw in Arlo a kindred spirit, someone who understood the quiet ache I carried, the longing for something deeper, something real. And as the days passed, the pull between us grew stronger, each encounter drawing us closer, binding us in ways I hadn't anticipated. It happened in the study, a room Jonathan rarely used. We were alone, the house empty, save for the sound of the waves crashing against the cliffs outside. I was leafing through a book on landscapes, admiring the rich colors and sweeping views, when Arlo entered, his presence filling the room with a quiet energy that made my heart race. He moved toward me, his footsteps soft on the thick carpet, and for a moment we simply stood there, wiped the silence between us thick with unspoken words. I looked up, meeting his gaze, and in that moment everything else faded away. The house, Jonathan, the life I had built. There was only Arlo, his eyes dark, his expression filled with a vulnerability that mirrored my own. Without a word, he reached out, his hand brushing against my cheek. And before I knew it, his lips were on mine, soft and searching, a tentative exploration that sent a shiver through me. I felt a warmth settle over me, a sense of peace and exhilaration, as though I were stepping into a world I had always longed for, but never dared to enter. When we pulled away, there was a moment of silence, a pause filled with the weight of what we had just done. I knew that our actions carried consequences, that we were walking a path filled with risks. But in that moment, I didn't care. All that mattered was the connection we shared, the bond that had grown in the quiet spaces of the estate, in the unspoken words that passed between us. In the days that followed, our relationship deepened, the boundaries between us dissolving as we found solace in each other's presence. We shared quiet moments in the early mornings, when the house was still, and the world felt as though it belonged to us alone. I would wake early, slipping out of bed to find him waiting in the garden, his eyes lighting up as he saw me approach. Our conversations became a lifeline, a chance to escape the constraints of the life I had built with Jonathan. Arlo would speak of his work, his plans, the things he wanted to create, and I found myself captivated by his passion, by the way he saw the world. There was a fire in him, a drive that reminded me of the dreams I had once held, dreams that had faded in the comfort of Jonathan's world. I, too, shared my secrets, my regrets, the things I had never told anyone. He listened, his gaze steady, his silence a comfort, a reminder that I was not alone. And as I spoke, I felt a weight lifting, a sense of release, as though I were shedding the layers of a life that no longer fit me. But with each shared moment, each secret encounter, the stakes grew higher, the risk of discovery looming over us like a shadow. Jonathan was perceptive, his gaze lingering on me a second too long, his questions subtly probing, as though he sensed the shift between us, even if he couldn't name it. I knew we were playing a dangerous game, that our actions carried consequences that would change everything. But I couldn't stop. The pull between us was too strong, the connection too real, and I was willing to risk everything for the chance to feel alive. As our relationship grew, so did the weight of my guilt. I would lie awake at night, listening to the sound of Jonathan's breathing beside me, feeling the ache of betrayal settle over me, a constant reminder of the life I was risking, the loyalty I was betraying. I told myself it was temporary, a fleeting escape from a life that had grown too quiet, too predictable. But deep down, I knew it was more than that. This wasn't just a passing attraction. It was something deeper, something that touched a part of me I hadn't realized was still alive. One night as I lay awake, I felt Jonathan stir beside me, his hand reaching for mine in the darkness. I felt a pang of guilt, a reminder of the man I had once loved, the life we had built together. But as I held his hand, feeling the familiar warmth, I realized that my heart was no longer his, that the love we had shared had faded, replaced by a quiet emptiness that I could no longer ignore. And in that moment, I knew that my choices had set me on a path I couldn't turn back from, a path that would lead to consequences I couldn't foresee, a path of shadows that stretched before me, filled with secrets and desires that could never be undone. Days blurred into weeks, and with each passing moment, the fragile web of secrets I had woven grew more tangled. Every glance, every word exchanged with Arlo was both thrilling and terrifying, a reminder of the risks we were taking, the delicate balance we had to maintain. Jonathan's presence became a quiet threat, his gaze more penetrating, his questions more pointed, as though he were piecing together a puzzle that I had hoped would remain hidden. Jonathan had always been observant, a man who noticed the smallest details. It was one of the traits I had admired when we first met, his ability to see the world with a clarity that seemed to elude most people. But now, that clarity felt like a spotlight, a beam of light cutting through the shadows that I had tried so hard to keep intact. I would catch him watching me, his gaze lingering just a second too long, his eyes filled with a quiet intensity that left me breathless. He never asked outright, never confronted me with accusations or demands, but his silence spoke volumes, each unspoken word a reminder that our time was running out. One evening, as we sat by the fire, Jonathan turned to me, his expression thoughtful, his voice calm, but edged with something I couldn't quite place. "You've been distracted lately, Coraline," he said, his gaze steady, his tone deceptively casual. "Is everything all right?" The question caught me off guard, and for a moment I felt the blood drain from my face, my heart pounding as I struggled to compose myself. I forced a smile, hoping he wouldn't see the panic lurking beneath the surface. "Just a lot on my mind," I replied, my voice steady but with a hint of tension that I hoped he wouldn't notice. "The estate, the renovations, it's all a bit overwhelming sometimes." He nodded, his gaze never wavering, as though he were dissecting my words, searching for hidden meanings. "I see. It's important to stay focused, though, isn't it? To remember what matters." There was a weight to his words, a subtle warning that sent a chill through me, a reminder that he was watching, that he was waiting for the truth to reveal itself. I swallowed, forcing myself to hold his gaze, to meet his silent challenge, even as a wave of fear washed over me. The tension grew each day, tightening around me like a vice, and in my desperation to escape, I found myself spending more time with Arlo, clinging to the connection we shared, the sense of freedom that filled me whenever I was with him. But even that freedom was tainted, shadowed by doubts and questions I hadn't dared to ask. One afternoon, while Jonathan was out meeting an old friend, I decided to search for a book in the study. I had always loved the quiet of the room, the rich scent of leather and old paper, the soft light that filtered through the windows. But as I pulled a book from the shelf, a stack of papers tumbled out, scattering across the floor. I knelt to gather them, intending to place them back, when a name caught my eye: Arlo Callahan. My heart skipped a beat as I scanned the pages, my hands trembling as I read through the documents. They were financial records, legal notices, letters from creditors, each one painting a picture of a life filled with struggles and debts, of a man haunted by choices he could not escape. There were payment demands, notices of default, even a letter threatening legal action. My mind raced, each line a revelation, each word a piece of a puzzle I hadn't known existed. I had thought I knew him, thought that our connection was built on truth, on a shared understanding. But now, as I read through the pages, a dark knot formed in my stomach, a sense of betrayal mingling with confusion. Had he come here because of these debts? Was he using me, our connection, as a way to escape his troubles, to find refuge from a life that was crumbling around him? I closed the folder, my hands shaking as I tried to make sense of what I had found. Part of me wanted to confront him, to demand answers, but another part of me was afraid of the truth, afraid of what his answers might reveal. I felt like a stranger in my own life, caught between loyalty to Jonathan and the love I had found with Arlo, torn between desire and doubt, trust and suspicion. That evening, I found Arlo on the terrace, watching the sun dip below the horizon, his expression distant, his shoulders tense. I approached him, my heart pounding, my mind racing with questions I didn't know how to ask. "Arlo," I began, my voice barely more than a whisper. "There's something I need to know." He turned to me, his gaze steady, his expression unreadable. "What is it?" I hesitated, searching for the right words, the words that would give me the answers I so desperately needed. "Why didn't you tell me about the debts, the financial trouble?" His face tightened, a flicker of something, regret, perhaps shame, crossing his expression. He looked away, his shoulders slumping, and for a moment I thought he might turn and leave, that he would slip back into the shadows, taking his secrets with him. But then he sighed, his voice filled with a quiet resignation. "I didn't want you to know," he said, his tone soft, almost defeated. I thought I could leave it behind, that it wouldn't matter here." His words struck a nerve. A reminder of the love I had thought we shared, the connection that had felt so real, so tangible. I wanted to forgive him, to hold on to the love we had built, but the doubts lingered, casting shadows over everything. A reminder that our relationship had been built on lies, on secrets that could no longer remain hidden. The next day, a longtime family friend named Vera came by, bringing with her a sense of familiarity and warmth that seemed out of place in the tension-filled air of the estate. Vera was a woman in her 70s, with a sharp wit and a way of seeing through people that left me feeling exposed, vulnerable. She had known Jonathan for decades, had watched him build his empire, and she looked at me with a mixture of kindness and scrutiny that unsettled me. "Something's different here, Coraline," she said, her tone casual, but with an undercurrent of concern. "You seem distracted." I forced a smile, hoping to brush off her words, but she was relentless, her gaze steady, piercing. "I've been thinking a lot, that's all," I replied, my voice calm but with a hint of unease. Vera nodded, her expression thoughtful, her gaze lingering on me with a quiet intensity. "Be careful, Coraline. I know Jonathan can be difficult, and I know you've been lonely. But secrets have a way of surfacing, and some are better left buried." Her words sent a chill through me, a reminder that our time was running out, that the delicate balance we had maintained was beginning to unravel. I tried to brush it off, to convince myself that she was just an old woman with a habit of prying. But the fear lingered, a gnawing sense of dread that followed me through each day, each encounter with Jonathan and Arlo. As the days passed, Jonathan's suspicions grew, his gaze more intense, his questions more probing, each one a reminder that he was closing in, that he was waiting for the truth to reveal itself. I felt like I was living on borrowed time, each moment filled with the tension of a secret that could no longer remain hidden. One evening, as we sat by the fire, Jonathan turned to me, his expression serious, his voice calm but edged with a quiet fury. "I know, Coraline," he said, his words cutting through the silence, each one a blow that left me breathless. "I know about you and Arlo." The words hung in the air, heavy with accusation, with the weight of a truth I could no longer deny. I felt my heart shatter, the fragments scattering into 1,000 pieces, each one a reminder of the love I had betrayed. I wanted to apologize, to explain, to beg for his forgiveness, but I knew that it was too late, that the damage had been done. And as Jonathan stood, his silence a final condemnation, I realized that I had lost everything, that the life I had built was gone, torn apart by the choices I had made and the lies I had told. The morning after Jonathan's confrontation, the house was unnervingly silent. Each step I took through its vast halls felt hollow, the weight of what he'd said still pressing on me. I could barely meet my own reflection, let alone face the man I had betrayed. Every room, every corner, seemed to hold his unspoken accusations, as if the house itself knew the full extent of my deception. Jonathan's demeanor had shifted to something I hadn't seen before. He was no longer the composed, private man who had preferred to keep his feelings hidden behind a mask of control. Instead, he looked at me with a simmering rage, his expressions marked by a bitterness I could feel with every glance. The distance between us was no longer just emotional. It was a gulf created by broken trust, and I was left with the reality of what I had sacrificed. Later that evening, as I gathered my thoughts in the study, Jonathan entered, his footsteps echoing off the polished floors. He stood across the room from me, his arms crossed, his face a mask of restrained fury. I braced myself, feeling my heart hammering in my chest, knowing that this moment would define everything. "Tell me the truth, Coraline," he said, his voice calm, but edged with a hardness that sent a chill through me. "I deserve at least that." I swallowed, forcing myself to meet his gaze, though every instinct told me to look away. "I never meant to hurt you, Jonathan," I whispered, my voice barely audible, the words heavy with the weight of my guilt. He let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head. "And yet, you did. You destroyed everything we built, everything we shared. Was it worth it?" The question cut through me, sharper than any accusation, and I felt tears prick at the corners of my eyes, a quiet admission of the choices I couldn't undo. I wanted to explain, to justify my actions, to tell him about the loneliness I had felt, the emptiness that had grown between us. But I knew that no explanation would be enough, that my words would only add to the pain I had already caused. "I don't know," I whispered, my voice breaking. "I was lost, Jonathan. I didn't know how to tell you." He nodded, his expression hardening. "And so instead you chose him. My own son, you betrayed me in the most unforgivable way." The silence that followed was suffocating. A chasm between us that felt insurmountable. I felt the weight of his words, the truth of his anger, and I knew that there was no path to redemption, no way to rebuild the life we had once shared. After our conversation, I felt a strange sense of emptiness, a hollow ache that seemed to settle in my chest, leaving me numb and directionless. I found Arlo in the garden, his posture tense, his expression filled with a mixture of guilt and anger as he looked out over the cliffs. He didn't turn as I approached, but I could feel the tension between us, the weight of our choices pressing down on both of us. "He knows," I said softly, my voice barely a whisper, the words lingering in the air like a final confession. Arlo nodded, his gaze distant, his expression unreadable. "I thought he might," he murmured, his tone laced with a quiet resignation. There was a pause, a silence that felt both comfortable and charged, and I realized, with a pang of sadness, that our connection had been built on something fragile, something that had always been destined to crumble. I had wanted to believe in him, to trust in the love we had shared, but now, as we stood there in the shadow of our choices, I could see the cracks, the places where we had both failed. "What happens now?" I asked, my voice trembling, filled with a mixture of fear and regret. He looked at me, his gaze steady, a hint of sadness in his eyes. "I don't know, Coraline, but I don't think there's a way back." The words hit like a slap, a reminder of the path we had chosen, the consequences we could no longer avoid. I wanted to reach out, to hold on to the connection we had shared, but I knew that it was over, that we had both reached the end of a road filled with shadows. In the days that followed, the house felt emptier than ever. Jonathan kept his distance, his silence a constant reminder of the trust I had broken, the life I had destroyed. Arlo, too, had withdrawn, his presence a ghostly reminder of the choices we had made, the love that had slipped through our fingers. And then one morning, Jonathan approached me, his expression calm but his eyes filled with a cold determination. "You need to leave, Coraline," he said, his voice firm, his tone final. This can't be mended." The words hung in the air, a sentence I had known was coming, but one I wasn't prepared to face. I felt a wave of sorrow wash over me, a realization of the life I was losing, the love I had destroyed in my search for something more. "I understand," I whispered, my voice breaking, the words a quiet acknowledgement of the path I had chosen, the consequences I had brought upon myself. He nodded, his expression softening for a brief moment, a flicker of the man I had once loved, the man I had betrayed. "I hope you find peace, Coraline." I really do." And with that, he turned and walked away, leaving me alone in the emptiness of the life we had built, a life that had crumbled under the weight of our secrets. In the weeks that followed, I left the estate and moved to a small apartment in a nearby coastal town. It was a modest place, nothing like the house Jonathan and I had shared. But in a way, its simplicity was a balm, a reminder that I was starting over, rebuilding from the remnants of a life I had thought was secure. The days were quiet, a stark contrast to the life I had known, filled with the muted sounds of the sea and the hum of distant traffic. I spent my mornings walking along the beach, my footsteps muffled by the sand, the waves lapping against the shore, each one a reminder of the passage of time, the inevitability of change. I had lost everything: Jonathan, the stability we had built together, the life I had taken for granted. And yet, in the silence, I found a strange kind of peace. A freedom that came from the absence of expectations, of roles I no longer had to play. I was alone, yes, but in that solitude, I began to understand the choices I had made, the path I had taken, and the reasons why I had allowed myself to fall into an affair that was as fleeting as it was destructive. As I sifted through the memories of that summer, I felt a mixture of regret and relief, a bittersweet understanding of the person I had been, the needs I had ignored, the desires I had suppressed. My affair with Arlo had been a way to escape, a desperate attempt to find something real, something that made me feel alive. But now, looking back, I could see that what I had been searching for couldn't be found in another person. It was something I needed to find within myself, a sense of purpose, of belonging, that went beyond the roles I had taken on, beyond the expectations that had defined my life with Jonathan. Arlo, too, had been searching, though his path was different, shaped by his own struggles, his own regrets. I wondered sometimes if he had found what he was looking for, if he had managed to build a life that was free from the shadows of his past. But I knew that I would likely never see him again, that our connection had been a brief moment in time, a passing storm that had left both of us changed, scarred, but perhaps stronger for it. In my quieter moments, I found myself revisiting the memories, not with anger or regret, but with a kind of acceptance, a recognition that every choice I had made had brought me to this place, to this life. And though I had lost much, I had also gained something, a resilience, a strength that came from facing the truth of who I was, of what I wanted, of the mistakes I had made. Now, as I sit here, looking out over the sea, the waves stretching endlessly before me, I feel a quiet resolve, a peace that comes from accepting the choices that have led me here. I am no longer haunted by the ghosts of my past, by the regrets and what-ifs that once filled my mind. I have found a freedom in the solitude, a strength in the quiet that surrounds me, and for the first time in years, I feel whole, complete, in a way that I never thought possible. I may never know if Arlo found the life he was searching for, if he ever discovered the peace he had been seeking in our time together. And I may never see Jonathan again, may never find the forgiveness I once craved. But I know now that I don't need it, that I am enough on my own, that the life I have built in the wake of everything I have lost is one that belongs to me, and me alone. As the sun sets over the water, casting the world in hues of gold and crimson, I find myself smiling, a quiet, bittersweet smile as I turn away from the past and face the future, ready to embrace whatever lies ahead. When I saw Nate holding the vibrator from my package, his face a mix of shock and curiosity, I felt my heart stop. The moment felt endless. He stood there in the living room, the open box of items on the coffee table, holding something no stepson should ever see. His eyes darted between the object in his hand and me as I froze in the doorway, clutching a basket of folded laundry. Evelyn, he stammered, his voice breaking the unbearable silence. "What the hell are you doing?" I snapped, setting the basket down with trembling hands. My cheeks burned, a mix of anger and humiliation washing over me as I crossed the room, snatching the item from his hand. I didn't mean, Nate began, stepping back defensively. I didn't know what it was. The package was just sitting here and You thought you'd open it? I cut him off, slamming the rest of the items back into the box and snapping the lid shut. You had no right, none, to touch it. Nate ran a hand through his hair, his face redder than I'd ever seen it. I didn't mean to invade your privacy. I thought it was like tools or something. Tools? I echoed, incredulous. Does this look like tools to you? He glanced at the now closed box, then back at me, his mouth opening and closing as he struggled for a response. I'm sorry, he said finally, his voice low. I wasn't trying to. Just forget about it, I interrupted, clutching the box tightly as I turned toward the stairs. Forget this ever happened. But as I stormed out of the room, I couldn't shake the look in his eyes. A flicker of something that wasn't just embarrassment or guilt. That night, I couldn't sleep. The incident replayed in my mind over and over as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling. Nate had apologized, sure, but something about the way he'd looked at me, confused, unsure, lingering just a second too long, stuck with me. And then there was me. My reaction had been more than just embarrassment. It was anger at myself, at the vulnerability that came with someone knowing something so private about me. Carl, my husband, had never even asked about my needs. Hell, he barely noticed when I was in the same room anymore. Those items in the package, they were a small rebellion, a way to reclaim some sense of control over my neglected life. But now, Nate knew. And knowing him, he wasn't going to forget. The next morning, I found him in the kitchen, staring into his coffee cup like it held all the answers in the world. When he looked up and saw me, his posture stiffened. About yesterday, he started, his voice cautious. Drop it, I said quickly, pouring myself a cup of tea and keeping my back to him. I just wanted to say I'm sorry, he continued, ignoring my attempt to shut him down. I shouldn't have opened it. It's none of my business. You're right, I said sharply, turning to face him. It's not. He nodded, the tension thick between us. It won't happen again. Good. But even as I said the word, I could feel his eyes on me. And I knew this wasn't over. It had been 3 weeks since Nate opened that package, but the awkwardness between us lingered like a shadow in the house. For the most part, we danced around each other, pretending nothing had happened, though I could feel his presence in every room. And when our paths crossed, whether it was in the kitchen, the living room, or the garden, the air between us felt charged, heavy with unspoken words. Carl, of course, remained oblivious. My husband had mastered the art of distraction, burying himself in work and hobbies, to the point where he barely noticed the tension simmering beneath the surface. That was the story of our marriage, really. 2 people sharing a house but living entirely separate lives. Carl and I had married when I was 46, after a whirlwind romance that now felt like a lifetime ago. At the time, I thought he was everything I wanted. Successful, charming, stable. But stability has a way of turning into monotony, and as the years passed, his attention drifted elsewhere. He was always on the phone, always in meetings, always too tired to notice when I dressed up or asked him about his day. I tried to tell myself it was normal, that this was just what marriage looked like after so many years. But when I found myself ordering that package, an act born out of loneliness and quiet defiance, I knew something had shifted. And then Nate moved back in. Nate was nothing like Carl. Where Carl was rigid and predictable, Nate was easygoing, spontaneous, curious. He had a way of making the house feel alive again, whether it was through the music he played while cooking or the stories he told about his failed tech startup. At 25, he was still trying to figure things out, though Carl wasn't shy about reminding him that he needed to get his act together. Nate took the criticism in stride, shrugging it off with a grin and a joke that usually made me laugh despite myself. You know, Evelyn, he said one afternoon as we worked side by side in the garden, my dad acts like he's got it all figured out, but half the time, I don't think he even knows what he's saying. I laughed, shaking my head. You shouldn't talk about your father like that. Why not? He said, smirking. It's not like he listens to me anyway. His honesty was refreshing, disarming even. And though I tried to keep our conversations light, I couldn't ignore the way he looked at me sometimes, like he was seeing something I didn't even realize I was showing. The first real shift happened one evening when Carl was out of town on a business trip. I was in the kitchen cleaning up after dinner when Nate walked in. He lingered by the counter, watching me as I scrubbed the dishes. "Need help?" he asked. "I've got it," I said, glancing at him. "But thanks." He didn't leave. Instead, he grabbed a towel and started drying the plates I handed him. For a while, we worked in silence, the rhythmic clinking of dishes the only sound in the room. Then he spoke. "Evelyn," he said, his voice low, "about the package." I stiffened, my hands pausing in the soapy water. "I thought we agreed to drop it." "I know," he said quickly, "but I can't stop thinking about it." I turned to face him, my heart racing. "There's nothing to think about, Nate. It was a mistake, an accident." He set the towel down, his gaze steady. "Was it?" "Yes," I said firmly, though my voice wavered. He took a step closer, his eyes searching mine. "You don't have to pretend with me, you know. I see how he treats you, how lonely you are." I opened my mouth to respond, but no words came. The weight of his words hung in the air, and for a moment I couldn't breathe. "You deserve more," he said softly. I shook my head, stepping back. "This conversation is over." But as I walked out of the kitchen, I couldn't ignore the way my chest tightened. Not with fear, but with something far more dangerous. The tension only grew after that night. Every glance, every accidental touch felt like a spark, and I found myself avoiding Nate whenever I could. But it didn't matter. He was everywhere. In the kitchen, in the garden, even in my dreams. One afternoon, as I was folding laundry in the guest room, he appeared in the doorway. "Evelyn," he said, his voice quiet. I looked up, my hands stilling over the towel in my lap. "What is it?" He hesitated, leaning against the doorframe. "Do you ever think about leaving?" The question caught me off guard, and for a moment I didn't know how to respond. "Leaving?" "This house. My dad. All of it," he said, his tone measured. I shook my head, forcing a laugh. "Where would I go?" "Anywhere," he said, his eyes locking on mine. "You don't have to stay here if you're not happy." His words sent a jolt through me, and I looked away, focusing on the towel in my hands. "It's not that simple, Nate." "Maybe it is," he said softly. When I finally looked up, the intensity in his gaze left me breathless. And in that moment, I knew I was standing on the edge of something I couldn't take back. It happened on a stormy night. The kind where the rain lashes against the windows and the house feels quieter than usual. Carl had called earlier to say he'd be staying late at work again. That left just me and Nate, sitting in the living room with the faint hum of the television playing in the background. He was sprawled on the couch, his long legs stretched out, while I sat in the armchair, a book open in my lap that I hadn't read a single word of. The tension between us had been building for weeks, and tonight, it felt unbearable. "You don't have to keep pretending, you know," Nate said suddenly, his voice cutting through the silence. I looked up from my book, startled. "Pretending?" "That you're okay," he said, sitting up now, his eyes locked on mine. "That everything in your life is fine. It's not." I set the book down, my heart racing. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Yes, you do," he said, his tone soft but insistent. "You don't have to lie to me, Evelyn. I see you. I've always seen you." His words hung in the air, heavy and charged, and for a moment I couldn't breathe. "This is inappropriate," I said, standing abruptly. "I think you should." "Why do you do that?" he interrupted, standing as well. "Do what?" I asked, my voice trembling. "Push people away," he said, stepping closer. "You deserve to be happy, Evelyn. You deserve to feel alive." I shook my head, backing away. "This is wrong, Nate. You know that." "Is it?" he asked, his gaze steady. "Because it doesn't feel wrong to me." Before I could respond, he reached for my hand, his touch sending a jolt through me. "You don't have to be afraid," he said softly. "Not with me." And then he kissed me. The first kiss was tentative, hesitant, as though he was waiting for me to pull away. But I didn't. I couldn't. When we finally broke apart, my heart was pounding, and I stared at him, unsure of what to say. "We can't do this," I whispered, though the words felt hollow. "I know," he said quietly, "but I don't regret it." Neither did I, though I didn't say it out loud. Instead, I turned and left the room, my mind spinning. The days that followed were a blur of stolen moments and whispered confessions. We tried to act normal when Carl was around, but the tension between us was impossible to ignore. One afternoon, as I was preparing lunch in the kitchen, Nate appeared behind me, his his presence sending a shiver down my spine. "Evelyn," he said, his voice low. I turned to face him, my breath catching at the look in his eyes. "What is it?" He didn't respond. Instead, he stepped closer, his hand brushing against mine. "We shouldn't," I said, though my voice lacked conviction. "I know," he replied, his gaze never leaving mine. "But I can't stop thinking about you." Neither could I. The affair escalated quickly. It was like a dam had broken, and there was no stopping the flood. One night, while Carl was away on a business trip, Nate and I found ourselves in the library. I was pretending to organize the shelves, though my hands trembled with every book I touched. "Do you ever feel trapped?" he asked, breaking the silence. I looked at him, startled. "What do you mean?" "Like you're living someone else's life," he said, his voice quiet. I hesitated before nodding. "All the time." He stepped closer, his gaze intense. "You don't have to stay here, Evelyn. You don't have to stay with him." "I don't have a choice," I whispered, tears welling in my eyes. "There's always a choice," he said, his hand reaching for mine. His touch was gentle, reassuring, and before I knew it, I was in his arms, his lips capturing mine in a kiss that left me breathless. We were careful, or at least we tried to be. But the secrecy only made it more exhilarating. One afternoon, while Carl was at the office, Nate and I were in the garden, hidden behind the tall rose bushes. I laughed as he reached for a pair of pruning shears, his hand brushing against mine. "You're terrible at this," I teased. "Maybe I just like the company," he said, his tone playful. The moment shifted as he stepped closer, his hand lingering on mine. "Evelyn," he murmured, his voice barely audible. Before I could respond, his lips were on mine, and for a moment, the rest of the world faded away. But as thrilling as our affair was, it came with its share of risks. One evening, while Carl was out with friends, I found myself in Nate's room. We were sitting on his bed, talking in hushed tones, when we heard the sound of a car pulling into the driveway. "Shit," I whispered, scrambling to my feet. Nate grabbed my hand, his expression serious. "Go, I'll cover for you." I nodded, slipping out of his room and down the hall just as Carl walked through the front door. My heart was racing, but I managed to keep my composure as I greeted him in the foyer. "You're home early," I said, forcing a smile. "Poker got canceled," he replied, his tone distracted. "Where's Nate?" "In his room, I think," I said quickly, hoping he wouldn't notice the flush in my cheeks. Carl nodded, heading toward the kitchen, and I let out a shaky breath, relieved that we'd avoided disaster. But we couldn't avoid it forever. The closer Nate and I grew, the more difficult it became to hide. And deep down, I knew it was only a matter of time before everything came crashing down. Secrets have a way of unraveling. No matter how carefully you try to keep them hidden, the weight of them pulls at the seams of your life until everything begins to fray. For weeks, Nate and I thought we were in control, but the cracks were beginning to show. It started with Lila, Carl's business partner, who had a habit of stopping by unannounced. "Lila's here," Carl said one Saturday afternoon, his voice carrying through the house as I stood in the kitchen preparing lunch. I froze for a moment, the knife in my hand hovering over the cutting board. Lila had a reputation for being nosy, and the thought of her snooping around the house sent a chill down my spine. "Tell her I'll be right out," I called back, forcing my voice to stay steady. When I walked into the living room a few minutes later, Lila was perched on the edge of the couch, her sharp eyes scanning the room like a hawk. "Evelyn," she said with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "So good to see you." "You too, Lila," I replied, sitting down across from her. She leaned back, crossing her legs. "Carl tells me Nate's been staying with you. How's that going?" "Fine," I said quickly. "He's been a big help around the house." "I'll bet," she said, her gaze lingering on me for a moment too long. "It must be nice having someone around while Carl's at work all the time." The implication in her words was clear, and I felt my chest tighten. "We're just glad we can support him while he figures things out," I said, keeping my tone light. Lila's smile widened, but her eyes were cold. "Of course." That evening I told Nate about the conversation. "She knows something," I said, pacing the length of the library as he sat on the couch watching me. "She's guessing," Nate replied, his tone calm. "She doesn't have anything concrete." "She doesn't need anything concrete," I shot back. "She just needs Carl to start asking questions." Nate stood, crossing the room to place his hands on my shoulders. We're careful, Evelyn. She can't prove anything. His touch was reassuring, but the knot of fear in my chest refused to loosen. Then, there was Matt, Nate's childhood friend who had recently moved back to town. He showed up one afternoon while Carl was at work, his arrival unannounced but not entirely surprising. "Matt," Nate said, his voice filled with genuine surprise as he opened the door. "Thought I'd stop by," Matt said with a grin, clapping Nate on the shoulder. "Catch up for a bit." I was in the kitchen when they walked in, and the sight of Matt made my stomach churn. He had a sharpness to him, a perceptiveness that made me uneasy. "Evelyn," he said, his grin widening as he saw me. "Still as lovely as ever." "Matt," I replied, forcing a smile. "It's been a while." Nate glanced at me, his expression unreadable, before turning back to Matt. "Let's catch up outside," he said quickly, steering his friend toward the patio. But even from the kitchen, I could hear snippets of their conversation. "She's different than I remember," Matt was saying. "Don't start," Nate replied, his tone warning. "Relax," Matt said, laughing. "I'm just saying, you've been spending a lot of time here, haven't you?" "What's your point?" Nate asked, his voice tight. "Nothing," Matt said, though his tone suggested otherwise. "Just be careful, man. People talk." The tension in the house was reaching a breaking point. Carl was growing more suspicious, Lila's visits were becoming more frequent, and Matt's prying had left Nate on edge. One evening, while Carl was out with Lila at a business dinner, Nate and I were in the library, our usual refuge. "We can't keep this up," I said, my voice trembling. "We've been careful," Nate said, though even he didn't sound convinced. "Not careful enough," I replied, pacing the room. "Carl's starting to notice, and Lila doesn't know anything," Nate interrupted, his tone firm. "She doesn't have to," I said, my voice rising. "She just has to say the right thing to Carl, and everything will fall apart." Nate stood, crossing the room to take my hands in his. "We'll figure it out," he said softly. "We always do." I wanted to believe him, but the weight of our secret was becoming too much to bear. The breaking point came 2 days later. Carl came home early from work, his expression dark as he walked into the house. I was in the kitchen, cleaning up after lunch, when he appeared in the doorway. "We need to talk," he said, his tone cold. I set down the dish I was holding, my heart pounding. "What's wrong?" "I had lunch with Lila today," he said, crossing his arms. "She told me some interesting things." I felt my stomach drop, but I forced myself to stay calm. "Like what?" "Like how you and Nate have been spending a lot of time together," he said, his eyes narrowing. "More than usual." "He's my stepson, Carl," I said quickly. "Of course we spend time together." "Don't play dumb, Evelyn," he snapped. "Lila thinks there's something going on, and now I'm starting to wonder if she's right." I opened my mouth to respond, but no words came. The weight of his accusation hung in the air, and for the first time I felt the walls closing in. That night, I found Nate in his room, packing a bag. "What are you doing?" I asked, my voice trembling. "Leaving," he said shortly, not looking at me. "You can't," I said, stepping closer. "I have to," he replied, his voice breaking. "It's only a matter of time before he finds out, and if he does—" He trailed off, shaking his head. "I won't let him hurt you," I said, my eyes filling with tears. Nate turned to face me, his expression softening. "You can't protect me, Evelyn, not from this." Before I could respond, he pulled me into his arms, holding me tightly. "I'll call you," he said quietly. And then he was gone. For the first few days after Nate left, the house felt impossibly quiet. I went through the motions, cleaning, cooking, pretending to watch television, but every corner of the house seemed to hold a memory of him. Carl, oblivious as ever, treated Nate's abrupt departure as a sign of his son finally taking responsibility for his life. But I knew better. Nate had left to protect us, or at least to protect me. But secrets have a way of resurfacing, no matter how far you try to bury them. It began with Carl acting strangely, more distant than usual, but not in his typical preoccupied way. He wasn't spending time in his study or watching his financial news shows like he always did. Instead, he spent hours on his laptop in the evenings, shutting the screen any time I walked by. One night, after he went to bed, I crept into the study and turned on his computer, curious about what he was hiding. What I found sent a chill down my spine. Dozens of emails between Carl and Lila, the subject lines vague, but the tone unmistakably conspiratorial. Lila, I'll dig deeper and see if anyone else noticed anything. Let me know what you find. I'm starting to think I was blind to all of it. The implication was clear. They were watching me. I didn't tell Nate. I couldn't. He had left to protect me, and dragging him back into this mess felt selfish. But as the days passed, Carl's suspicion grew more overt. You've been quiet lately, he said one morning over breakfast, his tone too casual. I'm always quiet, I replied, keeping my eyes on my plate. He chuckled, though it didn't reach his eyes. True, but something feels off, don't you think? I looked up at him, forcing a smile. I don't know what you mean. Carl leaned back in his chair, studying me. You're sure there's nothing you want to tell me? My heart raced, but I kept my voice steady. Nothing at all. A week later, the real twist came. I was in the garden trimming the roses when Matt showed up. He leaned on the fence, watching me with an expression that made my skin crawl. Long time no see, he said, his tone teasing. What do you want, Matt? I asked, not bothering to hide my irritation. Just checking in, he said, shrugging. Nate's been staying at my place, you know. That made me freeze. He has? Matt smirked. He didn't tell you? Interesting. I set down the pruning shears, my patience wearing thin. Is there a point to this visit, or are you just here to waste my time? His smirk faded, replaced by a more serious expression. Lila came to see me, he said. The blood drained from my face. What did she want? To know if I'd noticed anything strange between you and Nate, he said bluntly. And what did you tell her? I asked, my voice trembling. Relax, Matt said, holding up his hands. I didn't say anything, but I figured you should know she's digging. That evening, I received a message from Nate. I think Matt knows something. Be careful. I stared at the screen, my hands shaking. If Matt was talking to Lila, it was only a matter of time before Carl confronted me. It happened sooner than I expected. Carl came home early one afternoon, his expression cold and unreadable. He found me in the living room, folding laundry, and sat down across from me without a word. Carl? I asked, uneasy. Lila told me something interesting today, he said, his voice dangerously calm. I set down the laundry, my heart pounding. What did she say? She said she overheard Matt talking about you and Nate, he replied, his gaze piercing. About how close the two of you had gotten. That's ridiculous, I said quickly, though my voice wavered. Is it? Carl asked, leaning forward. Because I've been thinking about a lot of things lately. How Nate moved in and suddenly you seemed different, happier, distracted. I shook my head, my chest tightening. You're imagining things, Carl. Am I? He snapped, his voice rising. Because I don't think I am, Evelyn. I think there's something you're not telling me. I stood, my hands trembling. You're being paranoid. Am I? He repeated, standing as well. Or have you been lying to me this whole time? I opened my mouth to respond, but before I could, the doorbell rang. I wasn't prepared for who was standing on the other side of the door. Nate, what are you doing here? I whispered, my heart racing as I stepped outside, pulling the door closed behind me. I had to see you, he said, his expression tense. Matt's been acting weird. I think he's trying to set you up. Carl already knows something, I said, my voice shaking. He confronted me just now. Nate's jaw tightened. Then we need to tell him the truth, before someone else does. You don't understand, I said, my eyes filling with tears. If he finds out, he'll. Evelyn? Carl's voice called from inside. I turned, panic flooding through me. What's going on out here? Carl asked, stepping onto the porch. His eyes flicked between me and Nate, and I could see the pieces falling into place in his mind. Carl, I can explain, I began, but he held up a hand to silence me. You don't need to, he said, his voice cold. I've heard enough. The confrontation that followed was explosive. Carl demanded answers, his voice echoing through the house as he accused me of betraying him. Nate tried to defend me, but his presence only made things worse. By the time Carl stormed out of the house, slamming the door behind him, I was left trembling and unsure of what to do next. Nate placed a hand on my shoulder, his touch steadying me. We'll figure this out, he said quietly. But as I looked at him, I knew the damage had already been done. Carl didn't come home that night. I paced the living room, the silence of the house pressing down on me like a weight I couldn't escape. Nate sat on the edge of the couch, his hands clasped tightly together as he watched me with a mixture of worry and determination. You should go, I said, stopping mid-step to look at him. No, he replied firmly, shaking his head. I'm not leaving you to deal with this alone. This isn't your fight, Nate, I said, my voice trembling. It's mine. He stood, stepping toward me. It's our fight, he said softly. I won't abandon you, Evelyn. The tenderness in his voice nearly broke me, but before I could respond, the sound of a car pulling into the driveway sent my heart into a spiral. It's him, I whispered. Nate tensed, his jaw tightening as he moved closer to me. Whatever happens, I'm here. The front door swung open moments later, and Carl walked in. His tie was loosened, his shirt wrinkled, and the look on his face was a storm of anger and betrayal. He stopped in the entryway, his eyes locking onto me first, then shifting to Nate. I thought I made myself clear, Carl said coldly, his gaze hardening. You were supposed to leave. Carl, please, I said, stepping forward. Let's talk about this. Talk? He interrupted, his voice rising. You want to talk now, after everything? He turned to Nate, his hands curling into fists. How long has this been going on? Nate didn't flinch. It's not what you think. Don't lie to me, Carl shouted, his voice echoing through the house. You think I'm an idiot? You think I didn't see the way you looked at her? The way she looked at you? It's my fault, I said quickly, trying to defuse the situation. Don't blame him. I'll blame whoever I damn well want, Carl snapped, his eyes blazing. You betrayed me, Evelyn, both of you. Nate stepped in front of me, his body shielding mine. If you want to blame someone, blame me, he said firmly. But don't take it out on her. Carl laughed bitterly, shaking his head. Listen to you, acting like some kind of hero. You're nothing but a spoiled little boy playing house with someone else's wife. Stop it, I shouted, my voice cutting through the tension. This isn't helping anyone. Carl turned to me, his expression a mixture of rage and disbelief. Do you even care what you've done? You've destroyed this family. I stared at him, tears streaming down my face. This family was broken long before Nate came home. You just didn't want to see it. For a moment, Carl said nothing. Then, with a bitter laugh, he turned and grabbed his coat from the rack. Where are you going? I asked, my voice shaking. Anywhere but here, he said, slamming the door behind him. When the sound of his car faded into the night, I collapsed onto the couch, burying my face in my hands. Nate sat beside me, his arm around my shoulders, his presence steadying me, even as my world crumbled. We'll figure this out, he said softly. But as I looked at him, I couldn't help but wonder if we already had too much to lose.